Fired. Those are words that nobody ever likes to hear. I'm not firing you. But it fills you with a sense of dread if you hear those words. Your heart begins to pound and your palms begin to sweat and your blood pressure begins to rise. Your mind starts to race. All sorts of thoughts begin to fill your mind. Will I have enough money to make ends meet before I find a new job? Will I be able to get a job now that I've been fired? Is there anything that I can do to salvage my job or change the boss's mind? Will I lose my home? Am I going to need to sell some things to make the payment on my home? What am I going to tell my family? What am I going to tell my spouse when I get home? What am I going to tell my parents? What are they going to say when they found out that I lost my job? What am I going to tell my kids? What am I going to tell my neighbors? Whatever the case, whenever someone is at risk of losing his or her income, there is something that he or she cannot do. And that something is you can't do nothing. You need to act. You've got to start resolving the conflict, whatever it is. You've got to start filling out applications. You're going to have to cancel the big purchase that you just made online and ask for a refund. It's time to get serious. You get fired, it's time to get serious about what the future holds. And that type of situation is the situation that Jesus is describing in Luke chapter 16. He is addressing the topic of stewardship. Now, for many people, this is a tough text for a few reasons. In fact, I usually listen to 2 or 3 people preach on a text before I preach on it. I read 3, 4 different commentaries before I preach on it. And everybody that I listened to this week, they all say the same thing. Oh, this is the hardest parable. This is the hardest text, which I really don't think it is. I don't think it's that tough, really. But it's tough to some people because we forget a couple of things. We forget, first of all, that Jesus can teach by comparison or by contrast. In other words, he can liken a situation or he can contrast a situation. And as with the parable of the friend at midnight, which we studied a couple months ago, Jesus is contrasting the bad neighbor to the good God. He's also using some contrast in this parable. In other words, when we read about the shrewd steward, which you're going to read the whole text in just a second, Jesus is not likening the shrewd, squirrely, unjust steward to what Christians should do. He's making a contrast. He's only likening one little thing about the shrewd steward, not everything. The other problem that we have sometimes with texts is we tend to overthink some texts. We try to find some spiritual connection to every single detail in a text as we analyze it, but the only spiritual applications that we need to make when you study a text, especially a parable, are the ones that Jesus has already made for us. And your life is going to get a lot more simple when you read parables, when you just let Jesus do the heavy lifting. Let him do the heavy thinking. Let him make the simple applications that we need to make. And texts get a lot easier to study. And in this particular text, Jesus actually makes at least four points from this parable, and that is uncharacteristic. With many of the parables of Jesus, there's one simple point that is made from the parable, but in this text, there are at least 4 points that he is going to make. In fact, you get to the tail end of this text in Luke chapter 16, and it just seems like Jesus keeps piling on new applications to the text. Sometimes my family says to me, you know, Josh or Dad or honey, I found a good stopping point a couple of times during your sermon, but you just kept making more points. I guess other people agree with him. There's a good stopping point for Jesus in verse 8. But then he makes another point in verse 9, and then another in verses 10 through 12, and then another in verse 13. And so I simply say all that to say, kids and whoever just amen that, to think a preacher should stop teaching when he has more points to make simply means the preacher's being Christ-like. So that's my defense, and I'm sticking to it. So let's read the text here in Luke chapter 16, and let's take a look at what Jesus has to say to us here this morning. He said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager.' And the manager said to himself, 'What shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses.' And so summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, 'Well, take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. Then he said to another, 'And how much do you owe?' He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, 'Take your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light.'" The first application there is in verse 8, and we're going to see some more applications here in verses 9 through 13. "I tell you," Jesus says, "make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings." Another application is in verse 10. "One who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much. And one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? If you've not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own?" And then we have another application, verse 13. "No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." Then there's a little bit that he finishes off with here that we want to tack on to the lesson in verses 14 through 18. We kind of see the response of the Pharisees to what Jesus had to say here in this text. The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things and they ridiculed him. And he said to them, "You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God. The law and the prophets were until John, and since then the good news of the kingdom of God is preached, and everyone forces his way into it. But it's easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one dot of the law to become void." And then verse 18, which seems kind of out of context somewhat here. "Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. He who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery." All right. First of all, let's think about the basic story, which is found in verses 1 through 8. The basic story of what's called the shrewd steward, or the unjust steward, or the dishonest manager, as the ESV would phrase it. Let's think about it for a minute. First of all, when you look at verses 1 and 2 of Luke chapter 16, there is a bad report that has been brought to a rich man about his steward. And the steward is served his notice. He is told that he is going to be fired and he is going to be replaced. So what we really see here is just kind of this scary moment where the boss is saying, "I need to meet with you in my office." And when a boss says something like that to you, thoughts begin to race through your mind, right? Like, what have I done? Why am I in trouble? Am I in trouble? Why does he want to meet with me in his office? And so the steward is meeting with the boss, and the worst that you could possibly imagine happens, and the steward is told, "Your time is up." But it would seem when you read the text that he doesn't, box up his belongings and get escorted out by security right there on the spot. He continues to work while a replacement is found. And that sometimes happens in places of work, right? Sometimes you're fired immediately and you're gone. This is your last day. Pack up your stuff, go. Sometimes it's, hey, you're losing your job. We're going to give you a couple of months, or we're going to give you a couple of weeks. We still need to hire your replacement. We'd like you to help in the transition. And so it seems like this guy has a little bit of time because he continues to work a bit. In verses 3 and 4, what you find is that the steward begins to consider his future without a job. I mean, he's enjoyed this job that seems like a pretty cushy, high-paying job. And what you read in verse 3 is he really does not want to have to go to menial labor. He's got really soft hands because he's been working a desk job. His muscles are too weak, and he says, I can't go dig ditches. I can't do hard work out in the field. My body's not used to that. And then he says in verse 3 as well, he says, I'm ashamed to beg. I'm not going to go stand out with a tin cup or a will work for food sign or something like that and ask for people's help. That's embarrassing, especially when people know how well I've been living for all of this time. I don't want to do that. And so what he does is he comes up with a plan to save his backside from the embarrassment of all of that. In verse 4, he says, here's what I'm going to do. So that when I'm put out of the stewardship, when I officially serve my last day, there are other people that will receive me into their houses. And so in verses 5 through 8, what you see is the steward is working his plan. He gathers all the master's debtors together and he begins to cut them all a deal. He says to the one who is supposed to be paying in measures of oil, he says, go ahead and cut your bill in half. Perhaps the bill was already inflated. He cuts some of the commission out of it, possibly, but he makes him a deal. And if somebody says, I'm giving you 50% off, that's a deal that you're usually going to take, right? You're going to appreciate. You're saving me half of my money. And so he does that. He gathers them all together and he cuts this deal. Now, a couple things. Do you notice, first of all, in verse 6, when he says, how much do you owe? He says 100 measures of oil. He says to him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. Who's writing on the contract? The debtor. What is the debtor doing with the contract? He's altering the contract. What does that mean when it comes to being held accountable? What that means is you are complicit in altering a contract. What he did was dishonest. That's why he's called dishonest. That's why he's called shrewd. That's why this is very unethical, what he has done. This is why some people have a hard time understanding. Why would Jesus use this as an illustration? Because what this guy is doing is unethical. It seems a bit unfair. And then he does the same thing with the guy who is supposed to be paying in wheat. He says, take your bill and write 80. In your handwriting, go ahead and just mark out the 100 and write 80. Anybody ever had a kid that came home with a report card and they just marked out, the F to a B? The F looks kind of like a B, so they just added back in the days of handwritten report card. Am I the only person? I'm just. He's trying to trick them, right? He's trying to trick them. So they pay their reduced rate. The steward takes the payment to his master, and now he's got some money to show. And he's commended for his quick business sense. It's almost like the master is like, you little rascal. You made a little bit of money. You helped cover your bases a little bit, and you also set me up. But what he's also done is he's set himself up to blackmail the master's debtors. So basically, the master has a good laugh and thinks to himself, if only you had been working this hard and this smart the whole time, we could have avoided this whole scene. Now, what does all this mean to us as we read Luke chapter 16? Well, before we can interpret the unjust steward, We've got to avoid the temptation to overinterpret this parable. Not every detail was intended to be an example for us. Jesus doesn't want us to waste our master's goods through embezzlement. He doesn't want us to set other people up for blackmail in order to save our jobs. While the steward's master commends this behavior, Jesus never does. By the way, have you ever known a boss who commended unethical employees? This is real life. Some bosses commend their employees when they're unethical if it makes them more money. And Jesus is giving a real life example of this is the kind of person that this boss seems to be, okay with how his steward has been shrewd and unethical in order to make a little extra money. But it's because of this tendency some textual critics can't wrap their head around this text. But I want you to think of it this way. Is it possible for us to learn even from someone that you don't particularly think is reputable? Anybody ever watched a movie about a bank heist? You ever watched a movie about crime? You know, Ocean's 11 is kind of an older movie that was pretty popular movie a few years ago. I don't think that you should get a group of your buddies together to rob a casino. But I think people watch movies like that because they appreciate the ingenuity and the logic that it takes to accomplish the task, right? Sometimes we're really impressed with how smart con men can be. Con men can be rascals and reprobates. That doesn't mean they're not interesting. There are times that we even think to ourselves when it comes to con men and burglars and people who are unethical. Have you ever thought to yourself, if only they put as much energy into honest work as they do dishonest work, they could really make something of themselves. And I think that's what Jesus is doing here with the unjust steward. There's a lesson that Jesus wants his hearers to learn. He doesn't want you to imitate everything about the unjust steward, but there's one simple lesson, especially from him, that he wants us to learn. And we need to restrict ourselves to using those lessons as the exemplary ones, which are consistent with the ethics of Jesus. So what are those lessons? Number one, first lesson is this. He wants us to act with a sense of urgency. You read verse 8. Jesus concludes the parable, and here's the main point, the first point at least, that he attaches to the conclusion of the parable. The sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. Why would I say this parable is a contrast? Because Jesus makes a contrast right here. That the sons of this world, that's non-Christians, unbelievers, sometimes they're more shrewd and more savvy in their generation than the sons of light. That's Christians, that's believers, people who should know better. Now, what is it that this man did that was shrewd? Well, simply this. He realizes his future is looking very dim, and he acts hastily to try and fix it. And that's what Jesus wants you to learn first and foremost. The argument of Jesus is from the worse to the better then. If a child of the world can show wisdom and show urgency in fixing his earthly problems, then why can't the children of God think ahead to the judgment to come and be more diligent in preparing ourselves for eternity? 2 Peter chapter 3. That's essentially the question that Peter is asking when you read chapter 3, verses 11 through 13. Therefore, since all these things will be dissolved. What's all these things? The earth. One day, this earth is going to be dissolved, blown up, and the judgment is going to occur after that. The day of the Lord, verse 10 says, is going to come like a thief in the night. And therefore, since all these things will be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness? Peter's saying, wake up, prepare, get ready. Looking for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be dissolved, being on fire. The elements will melt with fervent heat. And so we, according to his promise, we look for new heavens and new earth in which righteousness dwells. Get ready, prepare. That's what Peter's saying. That's what Jesus is saying too. Saying this person could see that the end of his job was coming and he needed to do something quickly so he could continue to make some sort of an income. And so he did what he needed to do. He acted quickly. Now, I want you to think about what's involved in the unjust steward's urgent actions and how we need to take these principles and maybe make some spiritual applications. When he realized that he was losing his job, first of all, he very quickly learned to prioritize the main things and subordinate the secondary things. He has a short window to get his business done, and all other priorities get subordinated until it is done. We understand this in real life. If you're a student, you understand that when you have a final exam the next day, then the day before the final exam, perhaps even the week before, if you're really diligent, you need to make some time to study because you have an exam coming. You need to get prepared. When you have a final paper to write, then you need to make some time. Everything else comes second. You don't have time to go out and play cards with your friends and watch TV and scroll on. You got to put everything else down so that you can focus on getting that paper written or that project finished or preparing to study for that exam at semester's end. If only, what Jesus is saying, I think, if only we were as serious about life's end. If only we were as serious, we would subordinate everything else and make God a priority. If God is first, then why do we so often fail to make God the priority? So what we need to learn is a lesson from the unjust steward, that we need to learn to prioritize what's important and subordinate what is not nearly as important in our lives. Paul says, I press toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. So are you pressing and are you prioritizing the main things? So many times in our lives, we're not as smart as the children of this world. We prioritize secondary things. We make those things more important, and you can tell by how much we spend our time on those things, how much we spend our money on those things, and how much energy we expend on those things. This person realized time is up, and I've got to make finding a new job a priority. Finding a way to make money a priority, just like we have to look ahead to the future. So he prioritizes the main things. He acts promptly. Second thing, he acts promptly. He doesn't wait around to be rescued. He devises a plan. But planning doesn't work if you don't work the plan, though. So motivated people are movers. We learned that from the unjust steward. He gets moving. There's no more time for laziness. There's no time sitting around twiddling your thumbs just hoping, something will happen. He makes things happen. And when we realize that this life is temporary, we're not going to be procrastinators about getting our life right with God. We're going to move promptly. We're going to get to work. Business people know, the sons of this world, business people know that they need to have a vision. They need to have a plan. Well, so does the church. So do Christians. They need to know that they need to work the plan. Let me notice something else that he does, though, that I think is important. He finds himself some willing business partners. So he finds himself a couple of people that will help him to work his plan. What you think about that in regards to if your ultimate goal, if you're a Christian, your ultimate goal is heaven, you're really and truly planning for eternity. How often do we pretend that heaven is our priority, but we do not put ourselves around heaven-minded people who help us in our endeavors? People with good business sense, do you know what they do if they really want to run a good business? Then they put people around them who know how to run a good business. They choose business partners who know how to work the business and who are serious about working the business. They find like-minded, savvy business partners. The sons of this world are sometimes a whole lot smarter than the children of light. Why can't Christians figure out that if we really want to go to heaven, then we need to put people around us who have the spiritual savvy to help us towards our heavenward spiritual goals? This guy could figure that out. He acted with a sense of urgency. Second thing, the second point, second lesson that Jesus makes is in verse 9, though. In verse 8, first point, sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. Sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. I could illustrate that all day, by the way. We don't even have to go to the point 2, point 3, point 4. I could illustrate that all day. Have you ever been able to learn from someone who's not a Christian? You know, I'm going to keep illustrating it just for fun. When I was a freshman in college, I dated a girl who was a senior. She was Catholic, and we give Catholics a hard time sometimes, right? Because they believe some things that aren't consistent with Scripture. But I'll tell you one thing that I appreciated. We went to a movie one time, and we were sitting there, and there was some inappropriate language and inappropriate things, and she got up and she walked out. And I thought to myself, I know a lot of Christians that would sit there and watch that entire movie, and they wouldn't have the audacity and the strength and the moral character to get up and walk out. Sometimes the sons of this world can teach us a lesson. When I was in Indianapolis, I would drive to school, every day down to IUPUI downtown from where my house was. And I would drive down 38th and Michigan Road. And on 38th and Michigan Road, it didn't matter what the weather was like. There were always men who were dressed up in suits and ties, and they were handing out their papers. They were all Muslims. And I thought to myself, I don't believe what Muslims believe. I don't believe in Allah. But let me tell you something I really appreciate about these guys is that they are willing to share what they think is truth with other people every day, rain or shine, cold or hot. They are willing to work that plan. And sometimes the sons of this world are wiser in their generation than the sons of light. And I say the same thing when I see Jehovah's Witnesses knocking on doors and when I see Mormons working on doors. I don't agree with what they're teaching. What they're teaching is wrong. It's error. It's false teaching. But I can appreciate the effort that they put in to doing that work. And if we have the gospel, then why aren't we putting that kind of effort into the gospel? Sometimes the sons of this world are putting us to shame with how urgently and seriously they take their faith than the sons of light. Jesus wants us to see that. He wants us to wake up, be more urgent, be more serious about what you believe. Well, notice another thing that I think Jesus teaches from this text. Luke 16 and verse 9. He teaches us that we need to make friends with our wealth. So he begins to talk a little bit more about stewardship as he makes application. He says, I say to you, make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon. Make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home. You take a look at the shrewd steward and look at what he did. He cut a deal with his boss's debtors in order to win favor with them in case he were to lose his job soon. Perhaps they would take him in and help support him. They certainly appreciated a reduced bill, and so he used his money to make a few earthly friends. Wealth is a God-given tool that allows us to meet our needs, and it does help us enhance our relationships with other people. I think that's what Jesus is saying. Make friends with your money. That's one of the good things that you can do with your money. Make friends with people. This isn't inconsistent with the Old Testament, actually. Proverbs chapter 19 and verse 4 says, wealth makes many friends. Wealth makes many friends. Proverbs chapter 19 and verse 6 says, many entreat the favor of nobility. Every man is a friend to one who gives good gifts. Everybody wants to be a friend with someone who gives out good gifts. Paul says to the rich, 1 Timothy chapter 6, the New Testament, command those who are rich. So you have money. You've been blessed financially. Command those who are rich in this present age. He says, tell them not to be haughty, nor to trust in those uncertain riches, but in the living God who gives us richly all things to enjoy. And then he says, here's what you need to do with your riches. Let them do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to give, willing to share, storing up for themselves a good foundation for the time to come, that they may lay hold on eternal life. I don't think there's anything different in what Paul is saying in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 19, and what Jesus is saying right here in Luke chapter 16 and verse 9. Take your money and use it to help other people. If you're blessed with wealth, don't hoard it. Use it to do good. People appreciate a generous person more than they do a stingy one. Now, there's two senses in which perhaps this plays out in life. First of all, it plays out here on earth, right? Who doesn't appreciate somebody who prepares a meal for them or buys them dinner or even just buys them a cup of coffee? Who doesn't appreciate somebody who gives you a place to stay overnight or who gives you a ride in their car? Who doesn't appreciate somebody who gives you a little bit of cash in a time of need? How many students have been blessed by a scholarship or a trust fund that someone set aside to help make a field of study or help make a career possible? You appreciate the people who bless you financially. How many preachers have been equipped to go overseas because of the generosity of one or a few people who help support the cause? So here on earth, we can certainly make friends with people who help us financially, but Jesus doesn't talk about here on earth. In verse 9, he says that when you fail, I think that is when you die, he says that they may receive you into an everlasting home. They receive you into an everlasting home. So Jesus connects a thought that moves beyond our earthly sphere, and he connects it to eternity. And I think the simple point is this: one day your money is going to be of no use here on earth. You're going to die. Your stuff, your investments, you're going to leave them all to other people. You will not take it with you. And so Jesus is saying that use it now while you've got it. And when you get to heaven, isn't it going to be nice to be greeted by all the friends that you've made with your generosity along the way? I've had so many people. This happens a lot when you preach meetings and go places. I've had so many people take me out to dinner and pay for dinner and pay for meals. Hey, Brother Jones, when I get to heaven, I want to say it's good to see you. I remember when you hosted us for dinner in your home. I am so glad that we get to feast together for all of eternity now. Hey, Sister Janice, good to see you. I remember when our family was cooped up in that seedy, drug-infested hotel in Arkansas, and you paid for our upgraded suite at a better hotel. True story, by the way. Isn't it great that we both made it to heaven and we don't have to worry about that now? Hey there, Brother Paris. I never met you, but before you died, you left behind a trust fund, and it helped pay my hospital bills when I had COVID. And I am so glad that you're in a place that's free of pain and suffering, that we get to share together. And now I can personally say, thank you. Your gesture meant so much to me. Hey there, Sister Green from Barbados. When I went overseas, I remember you bringing a bag full of mangoes and limes from your backyard. It's all that you had to give. But isn't it awesome that we get to share the tree of life together forever now? One of the best parts of seeing old friends is the good memories in the past that we've shared, and sharing our food and our stuff and our wealth is one way that we create good memories. And so heaven is going to be a gift from a generous God that is going to be shared with generous people. And we get to relive those memories together. They're going to receive you into that everlasting home. Use your money to do good for other people, especially with regards to the kingdom. Now, with regards to the kingdom, let's take a look at this next section of verses in verses 10 through 12. Because the third point that Jesus makes from this parable is found here in verse 10. He who is faithful in what is least. You might think, well, I don't have a whole lot of money. Well, listen to what Jesus says here in verse 10. Even if all you have is just a little bit, even if all you have is a cup of cold water to give someone, even if it's just the leftovers from a meal, even if it's just a hand-me-down shirt, he who is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much. He who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much. Now, Think back to the problem that Jesus first addressed when he started this parable in chapter 16. He was talking about a steward that was wasting his master's goods. And for a minute, I want you to think about stewardship. And think about stewards, what a steward is. A steward's job is very simply, it is to care for what he has been entrusted with. So the accountant of a company, for example, the accountant doesn't possess the money. The accountant doesn't, it's not their money. They just make sure that the money is being spent and being used in an appropriate way. The caretaker of the home, caretaker of a home that's been hired out, they're not the people that own the home. The stuff in the home doesn't belong to them. They are just making sure that it's cleaned and that it's cared for on behalf of the homeowner. Now, as stewards on earth, we recognize that all of this earth and all of its stuff and its money and its things, they do not belong to us. They belong to God. And as stewards on earth, we recognize that our time, our treasures, our talents, they're not our own. They ultimately are creators that have been given to us to be used for His purposes and for His glory. My body, His choice. My money, His master plan. My wealth, I use it according to His will because it's all His. So no matter whether you've been given little or whether you've been given much, Jesus expects us, as we see from this statement here, to be faithful in the discharge of our physical and our spiritual gifts. I like what Wiersbe says in his commentary. He says, Christians are stewards of the gifts and the abilities that God has given them. And he quotes from 1 Peter 4 and verse 10. He says, we must use those gifts and abilities to serve others. The thief says, what's yours is mine. I'll take it. The selfish man says, what's mine is mine, I'll keep it. But the Christian must say, what's mine is a gift from God, I'll share it. We are stewards, and so we use our abilities to win the lost, to encourage the saints, and to meet the needs of hurting people. So if any of us are tempted by stinginess or hoarding, and we want to keep back on our time and our treasures and our talents, then I want you to really hear the questions that Jesus asked in verses 11 and 12. Because he says this to each and every one of us, if you have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, in how you use money, then who will commit to your trust the true riches? If you have not been faithful in what is another man's, it's God's. If you haven't been faithful in using what God has given you with your time, with your money, with the abilities that God has given you, then who will give you what is your own? If you won't give God some of your time here, why would He want to give you eternity? If you won't give God's people your treasures when you know that they are in need, then why would you expect eternal treasure? That's what Jesus is asking. So be faithful. Even if He's only given you little, be faithful in using that little for the glory of God, because it's all His. The final point that he makes is in verse 13. Money, third point, is money is a test of our faithfulness. The final point is we cannot serve two masters. You're going to have to make up which one's most important to you. Is it your money and is it your stuff and all the energy you put into accumulating those things? Or is it really God and His service and His will? So the final lesson is here in verse 13. No servant can serve two masters. You can't really do both. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he would be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon, or money, as some translations put it. So the lesson is simple here. Don't look at your service to God as a spare time side hustle. God doesn't want people who treat Him like He's a side hustle. God wants total devotion. He doesn't want us thinking that our stewardship to Him is a Sunday only thing, We can do what we want. We can spend how we want. We can put ourselves first all the other times. He doesn't want you to clock in at 9:30 Sunday morning and you clock out at noon. Think about what it meant to be a servant in first century Rome. Slavery was common in first century Rome. To be a slave meant that you were devoted to the master's will all of the time. There's no clock in, clock out after 40 hours. 24/7, the servant was thinking about how he could serve God. And so that's how we have to begin to think as servants of God. When I watch that movie, is this God's will that I be spending my time watching that? When I spent those 2 hours scrolling, was that God's will when I spent all that time wasting time on social media? When I spent money on that junk that I didn't really need, was that God's will that I spent my money on that, or were there better uses, better things I could have spent it on? When I spent all my energy on those endeavors, chasing those dreams, was that God's will when I could have used some of my ability and some of my energy spending it on other things for Him? We need to view our service to God with the same mentality. His will comes first all the time. We're always on the clock, and we're always thinking in all the decisions that we make about how we can use time, treasures, talents to best serve Him. Cannot serve God and mammon. Can't serve two masters. Those, I think, are the four simple applications that Jesus makes after the parable of the unjust steward. Now, question. How do you feel about this message? I know some people, they will not preach. They won't talk about money. They won't get that blunt when it comes to talking about these types of things. Do you know why? Because it ticks off people who are listening. So when the preacher says, you know what, you need to quit cheaping out on God, and you need to recognize that some of the money that you earn and that you make, it belongs to Him, and you need to give it back appropriately. And you need to quit being so selfish about how you're using your time, and you need to give more of your time to Him and to His people. And you got all this talent, all this ability, but you're wasting it on silly stuff. And you need to start spending more of that time and more of that ability that God's blessed you with for His glory and for His purposes. Sometimes people don't want to hear that. Sometimes people think, preacher, you're meddling now, right? According to the follow-up text that you're reading Luke chapter 16, they didn't like Jesus talking about this either. Because if you look at verse 14, it says, now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, when they heard all these things, they derided Him. They were upset with Jesus for saying some of the things that He said. Basically, Jesus saying, if you're not going to start using your money for God's glory, and you're just going to keep it for yourself, you're not going to go to heaven. That's what He said to them. Why would God give you the true riches? Why would God give you an everlasting home if you're just going to hoard it all? So they didn't like what He had to say. In fact, if you'll think about how Pharisees thought, the Pharisees actually measured their success and their money and everything they accumulated. They measured that as an indication of the favor of God. They thought to themselves, well, the reason why I'm so blessed is because God has favored me. The reason why I have a big house and all these things and all these investments is because, God is prospering me, and therefore it's an indication that God approves of me. But Jesus is making it clear to them by this parable that it's not the keeping of your money and your possessions that indicates the approval of God, but the willingness to share it and to give it. And not everybody likes that message. It's a message that's so true, though, that Jesus goes on to say this in verse 17. He says, it's easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one tittle of the law to fail. In other words, you may not like what I'm saying, but this is truth. And in the eternity to come, this is going to be a standard of your judgment. The use of your possessions and your wealth will be a standard for our judgment one day. So, how are you doing? Because one day we're going to be the ones that are called to the office. And God is going to stand in judgment. of how we have used our things and our opportunities and our time. So are you mastering your money and putting it in the proper place, or is it mastering you? Are you making friends and building spiritual relationships with your goods? Are you selfishly using those things? Are you faithful as a steward with the smallest of blessings and using those blessings to God's glory, or are they for your glory? Is Jesus Christ truly the Lord of your life, or is he only filling a part-time position because your devotion to money is pushing him out? We need to be careful that we not turn money into a second-class sin, because I think in America we're really tempted to do that. Oh, the big sinners, those are the rapists, those are the murderers, those are the people that are beating people up and abusing people. That's the big sin. Covetousness, materialism, and the stingy use of our wealth is just as much a sin as any of those other things. So be careful that we're not being pharisaical. Jesus says to the Pharisees in verse 15, you are those who justify yourselves before men. You try to give a reason, an excuse, a rationalization about why you use your money and your time and your things the way that you do. But he says very simply, he says, God knows your hearts. So you can justify it, rationalize it, look for the loophole, the excuse, all that you want, but God knows your hearts. So are you prepared to stand before the one who owns it all?